The date was October 20th, 1943. At the School of Tank Technology, nestled in Chubham, England, something momentous was about to happen. A 55-ton German Tiger tank rolled off a transport truck and onto British soil. Its tactical number was 131, and this machine would soon upend everything the Allies believed about German engineering. For nearly 10 months, this very tank had consumed the attention of military strategists across every Allied headquarters from London to Washington. They called the phenomenon Tiger Shock. It was real. It was devastating. Tank crews would freeze when they spotted that distinctive silhouette, knowing that an 88mm gun could reach out and destroy their vehicles from distances they couldn't even return fire from. The paralysis was genuine. The fear was justified. Stories spread through armored divisions like wildfire, each one adding another layer to the mystique. German armor that supposedly shrugged off direct hits. German engineering that was simply superior. Parliament grew restless with the situation and demanded answers. Winston Churchill himself had made a point of inspecting this exact Tiger while it sat in Tunisia, running his fingers across armor plating that seemed impossible to penetrate. But now, finally, British engineers would have their chance. They would unlock the secrets. They would understand the German innovations that made this tank so terrifying. The expectation was clear. They would find precision. They would find genius. They would discover why Allied tanks kept dying. What they would actually find would shatter the entire mythology around German armor. The truth, sitting right in front of them, would prove far more revealing than any amount of propaganda ever could be. Tiger 131's driver hatch bore damage, but not from enemy shells. Mechanical failure had done this. The crew had been forced to abandon their supposedly invincible machine right in the middle of combat because it simply stopped working. Even before systematic testing could begin, something became apparent to the British engineers. This tank that had terrified 2 continents couldn't reliably move under its own power. The legend of the Tiger was built on sand. The story had begun months earlier, back in January 1943. When reports started arriving from North Africa, those dispatches painted a picture of a machine that seemed almost supernatural. Armor that absorbed punishment, an 88mm gun that reached out across distances that seemed impossible, a vehicle that made existing battlefield tactics obsolete overnight. Tank crews talked about Tigers the way old sailors talked about sea monsters, with a mixture of awe and dread. The fear had a name: Tiger Shock. It gripped even veteran tankers, men who'd faced Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs without hesitation, suddenly asking themselves whether their Shermans and Churchills were really tanks or just coffins on tracks. Parliament wanted answers. The War Office needed solutions. Every intelligence officer from London to Washington had the same burning question: how do you stop a Tiger? On January 31st, 1943, British forces in Tunisia got their first chance to answer that question. They knocked out their first Tiger, but it required 5 direct hits from 6-pounder guns. 5 separate rounds, each one hitting the armor, penetrating systems that the technical manuals insisted shouldn't exist on any mobile vehicle. And yet there it was. The Tiger's own gun could destroy Allied tanks from over 2,100 meters away, outranging everything the British or Americans had fielded. Engineers who examined the wreck measured frontal armor 100 millimeters thick. The protection was real. Standard anti-tank rounds bounced off like sparks. The numbers were staggering. A 55-ton tank that moved. Armor that stopped everything. A gun that killed from beyond what you could even see on a dusty African battlefield. The British Army needed more than just a wrecked hull. They needed a working Tiger. They needed to take it apart, understand it, learn what made it tick. Above all, they needed to find the weaknesses before more Allied tank crews died thinking their machines were inadequate. Tiger 131 provided that chance. The crew had abandoned it near Jabal Jaffa in Tunisia after it simply refused to move anymore. Captured intact, it became the most valuable piece of military intelligence in the entire European theater. Engineers in North Africa performed initial examinations. Then Churchill himself came to inspect the tank in June 1943, standing beside its massive bulk while photographers captured the moment for public consumption. The Prime Minister grasped the significance. This wasn't just about tactics. This was about psychology. The Tiger had become a symbol of German technical mastery, and that symbol was destroying Allied morale just as effectively as the gun itself destroyed tanks. The decision was final. Tiger 131 would travel to England. It would go to the School of Tank Technology at Chubham Heath, where the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers operated the most sophisticated tank testing facility in the entire British Empire. There, away from combat pressure and political complications, a team could conduct real systematic evaluation. They would measure everything: armor composition, engine performance, fuel consumption, transmission reliability, suspension durability. They would examine every component, every bolt, every design decision, until they truly understood what the Tiger was. Major Douglas Litterdale of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers was assigned to lead this investigation. Unlike field commanders who encountered Tigers through gun sights and terror, Litterdale saw the tank as an engineering problem requiring analysis. He'd spent years keeping combat vehicles running, and he understood the difference between impressive specifications on paper and reality in the mud and chaos of war. His team consisted of practical men, mechanics who'd maintained tanks under fire, engineers who knew that impressive numbers meant nothing if a vehicle couldn't reach the battlefield. These weren't men who feared the Tiger. They wanted to understand it. Tiger 131 and its equipment arrived at the Department of Tank Design on October 19, 1943. The tank itself rolled off its transport truck the following day. Litterdale's team began their initial inspection right away, walking around the massive machine, noting details, recording measurements, organizing their testing approach. The numbers matched what intelligence had reported. 100 millimeters of frontal armor, the 88 millimeter KWK-36 gun, a weight of 55 tons. The preliminary British report from September had noted that the armor quality matched the best machinable armor plate available, German metallurgy at its finest. The engineers anticipated precision engineering. They anticipated innovative solutions. They anticipated discovering the technological advantage that made German armor so legendary. Tiger 131 had survived combat, capture, and an ocean crossing. Surely this represented the peak of German tank design. Then they looked more carefully. The driver's hatch showed damage, but not from enemy fire. Mechanical stress during combat operations had done this. British engineers had been forced to improvise back in May, installing a radio operator's hatch backward simply because the original had failed. Inside the vehicle, the damage told a more troubling story. Radios were destroyed, though not from battle impact. The turret traverse mechanism was stuck and slipped, rotating inconsistently, despite showing no obvious combat damage. Most significantly, combat reports from the field revealed what Litterdale's team was beginning to suspect. The German crew hadn't abandoned Tiger 131 because Allied weapons had disabled it. They'd abandoned it because the tank had stopped working. Litterdale outlined his systematic testing approach. His team would document the general layout, fighting arrangements, power plant performance, and survivability under fire. They would measure fuel consumption, load test the transmission, evaluate suspension durability. The work would consume months, but it would provide Allied commanders the comprehensive understanding they desperately required. Then politics stepped in. On November 15, 1943, Tiger 131 was diverted to London. The War Office wanted a propaganda victory. Tiger shock was a psychological weapon Germany wielded without firing a shot, and British leadership decided that displaying a captured Tiger would show that German superweapons could actually be defeated. The tank toured British cities for Bond fundraising drives, crowds touching the armor plate, staring at the massive gun in wonder. The propaganda was effective. It was also effective sabotage of the technical investigation that could have genuinely helped Allied tank crews survive combat. By the time Tiger 131 returned to Chubham just before 1944, Litterdale had been reassigned elsewhere. He would never work on Tigers again. The comprehensive testing fell to junior engineers from the Royal Tank Regiment and Royal Armoured Corps. not technical specialists, not men with Litterdale's methodical approach. They worked through 1944 at a glacial pace, systematically but slowly, while the war consumed resources and attention elsewhere. The urgent became the enemy of the important. Yet they persisted, and what they discovered would demolish every assumption about German engineering superiority. The junior engineers began their systematic examination in early 1944, and the first problem revealed itself before they even started the engine. Tiger 131 weighed 55 tons, 10 tons more than the original chassis was ever designed to carry. German engineers had begun with a 45-ton platform, then added thicker armor, a larger gun, more ammunition capacity, upgraded optics, and reinforced suspension without fundamentally redesigning the structure underneath. The result was a vehicle constantly operating beyond its intended limits, straining every mechanical system with weight those systems were never meant to handle. The low-mounted drive sprocket created immediate operational headaches. Ground clearance was limited, so the tracks tended to override the rear sprocket when crossing obstacles, jamming the drive system and immobilizing the tank completely. Field reports documented instances where a single stuck track required two other Tigers to provide towing assistance, if two other Tigers happened to be available and mechanically functional, which was never guaranteed. The track tension required to move 55 tons made emergency repairs nearly impossible. British engineers noted that splitting jammed tracks in field conditions couldn't be done by hand. German crews sometimes resorted to explosives, literally blowing apart their own tracks to free them, then attempting repairs under fire with enemy forces nearby. But the tracks were merely inconvenient compared to what the engineers discovered when they examined the suspension. The interleaved road wheels looked impressive in photographs, overlapping wheels that supposedly distributed weight and provided smooth travel over rough ground. German propaganda highlighted this as evidence of engineering brilliance. The reality was a maintenance nightmare that left British engineers stunned. Damage to a single inner wheel meant disassembling the complete outer wheel assembly, removing multiple outer wheels, their mounting brackets, suspension arms, and all associated hardware just to reach the damaged component. What took minutes to fix on a Sherman or Churchill took hours on a Tiger, and those hours assumed you had tools, parts, and time that combat operations never provided. Worse, the interleaved wheels created a trap that immobilized Tigers without any enemy involvement. Mud packed between the overlapping wheels, and when temperatures dropped overnight, that mud froze solid. Morning revealed Tigers locked in place by ice, unable to move, until crews spent hours chipping frozen mud from between dozens of wheel surfaces. The elegant engineering solution became a fatal vulnerability anywhere temperature dropped and the ground wasn't dry. Russian winters made the design a catastrophe. Italian mountain campaigns exposed its weaknesses relentlessly. Then the engineers examined the engine, and the full extent of German over-engineering became apparent. The HL210 engine displaced 21.33 liters and produced 650 horsepower, impressive numbers that masked fundamental design flaws. The aluminum cylinder block ran dangerously hot in its confined engine bay. Without adequate cooling, thermal stress cracked blocks and cylinder heads, allowing water and fuel to cross-contaminate. Once contamination started, the engine became non-functional, requiring complete replacement rather than field repair. British engineers documented these failures methodically, noting that German precision manufacturing meant nothing when the underlying design couldn't handle operational reality. Only the first 250 Tigers received the HL210. By May 1943, German engineers had developed the HL230, 23 liters, 700 horsepower, specifically to address the overheating problems. The fact that they needed a replacement engine within a single year of initial production told British analysts everything. The Tiger had never been properly tested before combat. Hitler had demanded an unstoppable breakthrough tank in 1941. German industry delivered in August 1942, before sustained combat operations exposed what the testing should have revealed all along. The numbers hit hard when engineers analyzed fuel consumption on a vehicle weighing 55 tons. Tiger 131 guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. nearly 3 gallons per mile on paved roads, over a gallon per kilometer. The fuel tank held just 128 gallons, which meant the tank could travel roughly 121 miles on roads before running dry day, or only 68 miles when moving cross-country through rough terrain. By comparison, a Churchill tank could cover twice that distance on the same amount of fuel. German maintenance records showed their Panther and Tiger engines typically lasted 700 to 1,000 kilometers before mechanics had to completely overhaul them or swap in replacements. Allied tanks routinely doubled that lifespan, and crucially, Allied supply systems could actually keep pace with their vehicles' fuel demands. The problem became starkly obvious when you looked at German logistics. Supply lines stretched across an entire continent, constantly harassed by enemy air attacks, struggling to deliver enough fuel to vehicles that burned through it faster than trucks could possibly bring it forward. Soviet engineers who tested the Tiger II, the bigger, supposedly improved successor to Tiger 131, found that fundamental problems hadn't been solved. The right engine group kept overheating during trials. When temperatures climbed above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, common during summer campaigns in Eastern Europe, the gearbox would overheat and fail. The right final drive bearing kept breaking, completely destroyed during one testing cycle. German precision manufacturing couldn't overcome poor engineering decisions baked into the design from the start. British engineers studying captured tanks compiled operational availability numbers that told a more damning story than any report could convey. During the second half of 1943, Tigers achieved only 36% operational availability. Take 10 Tigers assigned to a combat unit, and fewer than 4 would be ready for action on any given morning. The other 6 sat broken down, waiting for replacement parts that the German supply system couldn't deliver, needing repairs that field conditions made nearly impossible. The older Panzer IV, simpler and less impressive on paper, managed 48% availability. But Sherman and Churchill tanks consistently exceeded 80%, sometimes reaching 90% when supply lines worked smoothly and maintenance crews had time to do their jobs properly. One British engineer filed a report in September 1944 noting with understated dry humour that the finish and workmanship throughout was of a very high order. The precision was undeniable. German machinists had produced components manufactured to tolerances that British mass production simply couldn't match. Every piece fit together flawlessly. Every surface showed careful attention to detail. Every system represented sophisticated engineering solutions to complex mechanical challenges. But that level of precision carried a price Germany couldn't afford. Building a single Tiger required as much factory time as manufacturing 2 other German tanks. Each specialized component demanded specialized manufacturing capability. Tolerances this tight meant parts from one Tiger often didn't fit another Tiger, making field repairs dependent on exact replacement components that supply chains couldn't reliably deliver. The engineers had expected to discover the secret to German superiority. What they found instead was a cautionary lesson about the vast distance between engineering excellence and actual operational effectiveness. The Tiger wasn't invincible. It was fragile. The evidence accumulating in British testing facilities was just the beginning. Field reports from every theatre told the same story, written in shattered metal and broken machinery. Sicily in the summer of 1943 provided the first harsh lesson. German heavy tank battalions deployed their Tigers, expecting to dominate Allied armor through sheer technological superiority. Instead, narrow Sicilian roads climbing through steep mountain terrain exposed every weakness the British engineers would later document in controlled laboratory conditions. Tigers broke down constantly. Tracks peeled off during sharp turns. The complex interleaved suspension system clogged with dust and rocks. Most dangerously, German recovery vehicles couldn't handle 55-ton disabled tanks on mountain roads with 1,000-foot drops on one side. Combat losses proved minimal. Mechanical breakdowns destroyed entire units. German crews faced a cruel choice when their Tigers failed on those mountain roads. Either attempt to recover the immobilized vehicle and risk losing their recovery trucks on terrain they couldn't navigate, or destroy the Tiger to prevent the enemy from capturing it. Most chose destruction. They planted demolition charges, detonated them, and retreated on foot while Allied forces pushed forward. The last Tiger left Sicily by ferry on August 17, 1943. Withdrawn, not because Allied tanks defeated it, but because German logistics couldn't sustain operations with vehicles that burned more fuel, simply reaching the battlefield than they could carry for actual combat. The Tigers hadn't slowed the Allied advance meaningfully. They'd barely participated before mechanical reality rendered them irrelevant. Italy presented even grimmer circumstances. The Heavy Panzer Battalion 508 formed in August 1943 specifically to counter the Anzio landings. Between December 1943 and January 1944, the unit received 45 Tigers and shipped them to Italy with orders to destroy the Allied beachhead before it could expand. German planners stationed the battalion 200 kilometers from Anzio, a road march that Sherman and Churchill units routinely completed without significant mechanical losses. 60% of the Tigers suffered mechanical failures while navigating narrow Italian roads and sharp mountain switchbacks before they ever entered combat range. Transmissions overheated, final drives disintegrated, engines simply quit. Suspension systems collapsed under their own weight. The Tigers that actually reached Anzio and functioned fought effectively, but operational availability remained abysmal. For every Tiger engaging Allied forces, 2 more sat immobilized by mechanical problems that field mechanics couldn't solve. The Eastern Front documented the longest and most damning record of Tiger unreliability. The first Tigers deployed near Leningrad on September 16, 1942, and immediately revealed transmission problems so severe that German engineers had to design new components and rush them to the front while fighting continued. Production delays dragged on for months as factories scrambled to manufacture replacement parts for tanks already seeing combat. One Tiger became stuck in swampy ground near Leningrad, not hit by enemy fire, just mired in mud, and had to be abandoned when recovery proved impossible. Soviet forces captured it largely intact, studied its design, and prepared countermeasures while German propaganda continued promoting Tiger invincibility. German field commanders learned bitter lessons about Tiger limitations through accumulated disasters. They eventually issued standing orders. Tigers would not attempt to move more than 50 kilometers on their own tracks to prevent mechanical breakdowns before reaching combat. 50 kilometers, 30 miles, represented the maximum reliable distance before transmissions overheated, suspension systems failed, or engines quit completely. American Sherman units routinely moved hundreds of miles in under their own power. British Churchill battalions conducted major redeployments across entire theaters. Tigers needed rail transport for any significant movement, and Allied air superiority increasingly made rail movement suicidal. The Battle of the Bulge revealed how severely mechanical unreliability had compromised German armored strategy by late 1944. German commanders accepted that 20% of their tanks would suffer mechanical breakdown just during the initial road march to jump-off positions before combat even started. 1 in 5 tanks would be immobilized by its own failures. 20%. British armored units expected 5% breakdown rates during similar movements. American units with Sherman tanks and tank destroyers expected 1% failure rates, 20 times lower than German forces, accepted as routine operations. The gap between German and Allied mechanical reliability had grown so enormous that it fundamentally altered how offensives were planned. German attacks had to assume losing entire battalions to mechanical attrition before engaging enemy forces. On March 17, 1943, in Tunisia, the 504th Heavy Tank Battalion received orders to move 14 Tigers from Tunis to Meknasi, a 300-kilometer road march to stop an American breakthrough. 14 Tigers departed. 12 arrived on March 19th. 2 broke down en route. A 14% failure rate on a movement that Sherman battalions completed with virtually 0 losses. The 12 surviving Tigers did successfully stop the American breakthrough on March 20th, demonstrating the devastating combat power Tigers could deliver when they reached the battlefield and remained operational. But even this successful action revealed the fundamental problem. German heavy armor couldn't reliably move itself to where the fighting occurred. British engineers cross-referenced field reports against their laboratory findings and watched the complete picture emerge. The HL-210 engines, with aluminum blocks cracked from thermal stress. Field reports documented Tigers abandoned with cracked engine blocks across every theatre. The interleaved wheels jammed with mud and ice. Field reports from the Eastern Front described entire Tiger battalions immobilized overnight when temperatures dropped below freezing. The transmission required complete turret removal to repair. Field reports noted Tigers abandoned with transmission failures because the fighting conditions made such extensive repairs impossible. Every weakness British engineers measured in controlled testing conditions had killed Tigers in actual combat, not through enemy action but through mechanical collapse. The operational availability statistics painted a picture propaganda couldn't hide. 36% operational availability meant German heavy tank battalions fought at roughly one-third combat strength on average. A battalion deploying 45 Tigers typically had only 15 available for combat on any given day. The remaining 30 sat disabled, waiting for parts, undergoing repairs, or abandoned after failures that field maintenance couldn't address. Allied tank battalions with 85% availability outnumbered functional German armor, even when paper strength suggested they should be evenly matched. A Sherman battalion with 50 tanks put 42 into combat. A Tiger battalion with 45 tanks fielded 16. The mathematics of reliability determined battlefield outcomes far more decisively than armor thickness or gun caliber. Soviet, British, and American intelligence officers compared observations and reached identical conclusions from different angles. The Tiger's reputation exceeded its actual capability. The fear it inspired outweighed the tactical advantage it provided. Tiger shock was genuine, but it represented psychological warfare, not technological dominance. Allied tank crews died convinced they piloted inadequate machines against superior German engineering. The reality proved simpler and more brutal. They faced tanks that couldn't reliably reach the battlefield, couldn't operate for extended periods without breaking down, and couldn't be sustained by logistics systems already collapsing under Allied air attacks and strategic bombing. The British engineers at Chobham compiled their final comparative analysis in late 1944, producing a document that fundamentally reshaped Allied understanding of armored warfare. They arranged the data in stark columns that communicated a message more powerful than any combat story. Tiger 131 consumed 2.75 gallons per mile. Sherman burned 2 gallons per mile. Churchill consumed 2.2 gallons per mile. Road range for the Tiger, 121 miles before refueling. Off-road range, 68 miles. The Sherman managed 90 miles off-road despite similar road range, because American engineers had optimized engine efficiency for varied terrain. The Churchill achieved 75 miles off-road with better fuel economy than either competitor. But the operational availability statistics revealed the deepest truth. Tigers at 36%, Shermans and Churchills consistently above 80%, sometimes reaching 85% when maintenance crews had adequate time and spare parts available. The engineers grasped what those numbers meant operationally. A German heavy tank battalion with 45 Tigers on paper fielded 16 combat-ready tanks on average. An American tank battalion with 50 Shermans put 42 into combat. The British and Americans didn't need thicker armor or larger guns. They needed tanks that started when crews turned the ignition key, that completed road marches without transmission failures, that could be repaired in hours rather than days when something broke down. Reliability was the killer advantage, and German engineers had sacrificed it while pursuing perfection in individual specifications. The numbers revealed just how resource-starved German industry had become. Building a single Tiger consumed factory hours at twice the rate needed for any other German tank. The skilled workers, the precision machine tools, the hard-to-find specialized parts, all of it demanded double the commitment. Supply chains buckled under the strain of delivering components for even modest Tiger production runs. Meanwhile, German factories could churn out 2 Panzer IVs in the time required to construct 1 Tiger. Those Panzer IVs were 3 times more likely to actually be combat-ready when commanders needed them. The logic was merciless and unavoidable. German plants were grinding away to produce limited quantities of wonderfully complex machines that spent most of their operational lives waiting in repair shops. By contrast, Allied factories pumped out simpler vehicles that genuinely fought. This disparity sent ripples through every Allied planning room. Each Tiger broken down by mechanical failure represented an enormous German resource investment that delivered absolutely nothing on the battlefield. Every Tiger abandoned when recovery proved impossible meant trained crews trudging back on foot, years of specialized instruction wasted, combat experience that could never be replaced simply gone. The Germans were essentially destroying their own heavy armor more effectively than any Allied gun could manage. One jammed transmission, one cracked engine block at a time. British engineering teams documented this reality in their reports with surgical clarity, yet the human tragedy ran deeper. German tank crews weren't dying because Allied soldiers outfought them. They were dying because their own vehicles gave up at the worst possible moments. For Peter Guggen of the 48th Royal Tank Regiment, that reality struck home on April 21, 1943. His Churchill Mark III caught a direct Tiger round during his regiment's baptism of fire in Tunisia. The 88mm shell punched clean through the front plate, screamed through the fighting compartment, and tore into the engine. Guggen's crew scrambled out while machine gun fire tore up the ground around them. The Tiger that destroyed his tank was absolutely lethal when everything ran smoothly, yet Guggen lived. His crew suffered only minor wounds. 3 days later, they climbed back into another Churchill and returned to combat. The Tiger that hit them never made it back. Its crew abandoned it after mechanical breakdowns left it stranded and useless. Guggen's Churchill was plainer, less impressive on the specification sheet, equipped with a gun that couldn't penetrate Tiger armor at any practical distance. But it worked reliably. It carried him and his crew to the battlefield. It brought them home again. Within 72 hours, it was ready for another fight. The Tiger crew walked back to their lines and waited weeks for a replacement vehicle. Gradually, Allied tank crews began absorbing a truth that intelligence reports and British engineering studies had been revealing. The Tiger fear that had gripped them since early 1943 was built on encounters with a machine that proved genuinely deadly only during those rare moments when everything cooperated perfectly. Those moments happened seldom. Most Tigers never even reached the fighting. Most of the ones that did reach combat seized up before serious operations began. Most of the ones that kept running eventually suffered catastrophic breakdowns that stranded the crews. The psychological terror the Tiger generated for Germany was genuinely massive. The actual tactical advantage was severely limited by mechanical reality that no propaganda campaign could overcome. By late 1944, Allied commanders had stopped treating Tiger sightings as immediate existential crises requiring urgent tactical adjustments. Intelligence officers taught tank crews to separate genuine Tiger encounters from Tiger mythology. The 88mm gun was indeed devastating. The armor was nearly impenetrable from the front. But the Tiger wasn't invincible, and German engineering superiority wasn't the reason Allied tank crews faced difficult odds. The reason was that Tigers which actually reached combat and stayed operational were commanded by veterans who'd survived long enough to develop genuine skill. Those Tigers were typically positioned at crucial moments where German commanders desperately needed breakthrough results. Skilled crews operating powerful weapons at critical junctures created the Tiger legend. The mechanical unreliability that kept most Tigers away from fighting never entered the mythology. At Chobham, British engineers completed their work in early 1945 as the European war moved toward its conclusion. Tiger 131 had surrendered its secrets through methodical examination that political considerations had repeatedly delayed and bureaucratic obstacles had complicated. The comprehensive testing program Major Littledale had envisioned back in October 1943 consumed more than a year to execute, carried out by junior engineers juggling shifting priorities and constant interruptions. But the work got done. They examined every system, recorded every specification, tested every manufacturer's claim. Their findings circulated through Allied intelligence channels, reaching commanders who'd encountered tigers and survived, analysts attempting to decode German armored tactics, engineers designing the next generation of Allied tanks. The conclusion was unmistakable and devastating. German over-engineering had created a machine that looked impressive on paper and terrified through propaganda, yet failed catastrophically in actual service. The Tiger embodied the seductive delusion that maximum specifications equal maximum effectiveness, that precision manufacturing guarantees battlefield performance, that engineering perfection surpasses operational reliability. British and American designers had reached opposite conclusions. They'd built tanks that were sufficiently armored to protect crews from most hits. Armed with guns capable of defeating most opponents, equipped with engines reliable enough to reach combat areas. They'd optimized for availability instead of capability, for maintainability instead of sophistication, for mass production instead of precision craftsmanship. The Tiger's failure wasn't because Allied weapons eventually overcame it, but because German engineers had defeated themselves. They'd delivered exactly what Hitler demanded: an unstoppable breakthrough tank with maximum firepower and protection. They'd sacrificed everything achieving those maximums: reliability, sustainability, manufacturability, maintainability. The outcome was a splendid failure that consumed vast resources, generated tremendous fear, yet ultimately contributed less to German tactical success than simpler tanks it was meant to supersede. Tiger 131's deeper irony emerged not from what British engineers discovered about German design, but from what they learned about Allied thinking. For 10 months, Allied intelligence had operated believing German technological superiority was genuine, demonstrable, and decisive. They'd assumed Tigers dominated battlefields because German designers had resolved problems Allied engineers couldn't crack. The propaganda had gained credibility, partly because combat results seemed to confirm it. Tigers killed Allied tanks from distances and with efficiency, suggesting fundamental advantages in design philosophy. Systematic testing at Chobham revealed something far more unsettling than German superiority. It exposed how thoroughly the Allies had been psychologically defeated by their own doubts. Tiger shock wasn't really about Tigers. It originated from conviction that Tigers represented something Allied industry couldn't replicate. British and American crews went into combat believing their tanks were inadequate, convinced German engineering had achieved breakthroughs rendering Allied armor obsolete. That belief shaped tactical decisions, influenced morale, determined battlefield performance more than actual tank capabilities. When Sherman crews spotted a Tiger, they frequently retreated or requested artillery instead of engaging, not because Shermans couldn't fight Tigers under favorable circumstances, but because crews believed doing so was suicide. The psychological edge Germany derived from Tiger reputation far outweighed the actual tactical benefit Tigers delivered. British engineers grasped this dynamic as testing unveiled the space between Tiger mythology and Tiger reality. Every mechanical failure they recorded, every reliability issue they measured, every design weakness they identified was something German crews had already experienced fighting since September 1942. German tankers understood their Tigers broke down incessantly. German mechanics understood interleaved wheels jammed with mud, transmissions failed, engines cracked from thermal stress. German supply officers knew they couldn't maintain fuel consumption rates running in gallons per mile. But Allied intelligence remained ignorant because actual combat only showed what Tigers accomplished during those brief windows when everything functioned, not what happened across sustained operations. The testing program at Chobham demanded time the Allies couldn't spare and produced findings arriving too late to prevent already incurred casualties. Had Littledale's evaluation proceeded on schedule in November 1943, without the propaganda exhibition interruption, Allied commanders would have grasped Tiger vulnerabilities by early 1944. Tank crews would have recognized Tigers as dangerous but not unstoppable, powerful but unreliable, devastating in ambush yet vulnerable to mechanical failure. The psychological grip Germany wielded through Tiger reputation would have shattered perhaps a year sooner. Instead, political pressure to display the captured Tiger for civilian morale delayed technical analysis that would have benefited military morale far more substantially. The junior engineers inheriting the project following Littledale's reassignment worked through 1944 with limited resources and perpetually shifting priorities. Testing proceeded whenever circumstances permitted. Documentation advanced as resources allowed. Reports accumulated section by section as possibilities emerged. Their unglamorous methodical labor ultimately proved more valuable than dramatic combat encounters because they delivered comprehensive understanding that battlefield observations couldn't supply. A tank crew surviving a Tiger engagement learned that particular Tiger was dangerous. The engineers at Chobham demonstrated that Tigers as a category were fundamentally compromised by design choices emphasizing specifications over reliability. By the time British reports reached Allied commands in late 1944 and early 1945, Germany's strategic position had already collapsed decisively. Allied air superiority had destroyed German logistics networks, making it nearly impossible sustaining mechanically fragile vehicles demanding enormous fuel quantities. Strategic bombing had ravaged German production facilities, crippling Tiger deliveries to combat units. Most significantly, accumulated losses of experienced German tank crews meant Tigers reaching combat were increasingly operated by insufficiently trained personnel unable to maximize vehicle capabilities before mechanical failures disabled them. The Tiger's moment had passed, not because Allied weapons finally matched it, but because the operational circumstances allowing Tiger success never materialized. Tiger 131 remained at Chobham as the war concluded, embodying the gap between engineering ambition and practical reality. The tank that had alarmed Allied intelligence in early 1943 transformed into a teaching tool by 1945, illustrating for subsequent tank designers what to avoid. British engineers employed it instructing students in practical design principles. Reliability transcending sophistication, maintainability surpassing precision, availability outweighing capability. The lessons Tiger 131 imparted weren't about armor thickness or gun bore. They addressed fundamental requirements determining whether tanks actually engaged in combat or remained disabled awaiting repairs. Post-war examination of German records confirmed British testing conclusions. Germany manufactured only 1,347 Tiger Is across the entire war, August 1942 through August 1944, compared to 49,234 American Shermans and over 50,000 Soviet T-34s. Production figures alone predicted the outcome. German industry couldn't manufacture sophisticated machines rapidly enough, replacing combat losses and mechanical casualties. Allied factories mass-produced simpler machines, arriving in overwhelming quantities, and numbers mattered more than individual vehicle performance. The strategic principle transcended tank design. German World War II military doctrine consistently favored quality over quantity, sophistication over simplicity, engineering perfection over practical effectiveness. The Tiger exemplified this approach tactically. German commanders applied identical reasoning operationally, expecting smaller numbers of superior troops with superior equipment, overwhelming numerically superior allies through tactical brilliance. The strategy succeeded in specific engagements, generating impressive local victories and producing legends persisting decades, yet failed strategically because wars aren't won by tactical excellence. Wars are won through logistics, sustainability, and the unglamorous capacity continuing the fight after initial advantages fade. Tiger 131's ultimate contribution to Allied victory wasn't intelligence about German tank design. It was teaching the difference between what appears impressive and what genuinely functions. British engineers examining the Tiger recognized German manufacturing capabilities as exceptional, German metallurgy as superb, German designs occasionally exceeding Allied capabilities in specific areas. Yet they also understood that technical advantages meant nothing if the resulting tank couldn't reliably reach combat, couldn't operate extensively without breakdown, and couldn't be supported by logistic systems operating under continuous air assault. The Tiger was a splendid machine, demonstrating how engineering excellence without operational wisdom produces failure disguised as sophistication. Decades afterward, Tiger 131 discovered permanent residence at the Bovington Tank Museum, restored to running condition as the world's sole operational Tiger. Visitors would admire its size, its armor, its gun. They'd envision the terror it inspired among Allied crews facing it in combat. Few would grasp the fundamental truth British engineers uncovered in 1944. The Tiger's ultimate weapon wasn't its 88mm gun. It was the mythology of German engineering supremacy. That mythology perished at Chobham when meticulous engineers demonstrated that impressive specifications don't determine wars. Dependability does.